The dirt under my fingernails is permanent now, but the black sedan on my gravel drive smelled like a different kind of grave. 600 acres of dent corn stood tall, a dry, rhythmic sound like 1,000 women brushing their hair at once. But I wasn't listening to the harvest. I was watching the dust settle on the hood of my Ford. Ethan stepped out, his suit too sharp for the landscape, looking like a jagged piece of glass dropped in a wheat field. He didn't belong here anymore, even if his grandfather's boots used to walk this same mud. He held a bottle of Cabernet by the neck and a manila envelope that felt heavier than a sledgehammer. "The golden harvest, Sarah," he said, his voice smooth as polished stone. "I saw the USDA projections. You're the talk of the county." I didn't smile. My face wasn't built for it anymore. I just took the bottle. The glass was cold, sweating against my calloused palm. We walked toward the porch, the floorboards groaning under our weight in a language we both knew from childhood. He'd been the boy who cried when he fell in the creek. I'd been the one to pull him out. He spread the papers on the scarred oak table. The ink looked blacker than usual under the porch light. "The state's looking for a reason to bleed the independent hold, Sarah." He leaned in, the scent of expensive peppermint hiding the smell of the city on him. "These filings, they're a shell, a legal blind. We moved the deed into the trust I've structured, and the tax man finds nothing but an empty pocket. It stays yours, but on paper, you're invisible." I looked at the signature line. My pulse thrummed in my thumb, a steady, heavy beat. I thought of the bank notices, the rising cost of diesel, and the way the winter seemed to get longer every year. I picked up the pen. It felt light, flimsy compared to the grease gun or the steering knob of the Massey Ferguson. "You're sure about the clause on page 12, Ethan?" I asked. "I grew up in that barn, Sarah," he said, pointing toward the shadow of the outbuildings. "I'm not about to let them take the roof off it. Trust me." I traced the grain of the wood on the table, then pressed the nib to the paper. The ink spread, a small dark stain, permanent as a shadow. I signed my name 3 times. Sarah Collins, Sarah Collins, Sarah Collins. Each stroke felt like a final transaction of the soul. Ethan tucked the papers back into the envelope with a snap that sounded like a bone breaking in the quiet evening. He didn't stay for a drink. He moved with the nervous efficiency of a businessman who had just stolen a life. He walked back to his car, his gait hurried, the taillights of the sedan disappearing into the dark like 2 predatory eyes. I sat there in the dark, the cold bottle of wine unopened on the table. The wind picked up, and for the first time in 42 years, the rustle of the corn didn't sound like a harvest. It sounded like a warning. Justice doesn't grow like corn. You have to dig it out of the dark, cold and heavy. Ethan had the name on the paper, but the land knew my scent. And as the winter set in, I realized that some things don't need to be spoken to be understood. The dirt remembers. It always remembers. The mail carrier didn't stop at the box. He drove up the rise and handed me the thick white envelope through the window of his LLV, his eyes fixed on the steering wheel. He'd lived in this county as long as I had, and he knew how to read the return address of a high-rise firm in Des Moines. The paper was heavy, bleached, bone white, and it crinkled like dry husks when I tore it open. Transfer of title. The words didn't make sense. I looked at my hands, stained with the black grease of a busted hydraulic line, and then back at the paper. My name was there, but it sat next to a word that didn't belong to me. Grantor. Below it, in the cold precision of a laser printer, was Ethan's corporate entity. I was still holding the paper when the black sedan returned. It didn't kick up dust this time. It moved slow, a funeral crawl. Ethan stepped out, looking like a jagged piece of glass dropped in a wheat field. He wasn't wearing the jacket, just the vest. His shirt sleeves rolled up to the elbows. He held a manila envelope that felt heavier than a sledgehammer. He didn't look at the barn. He looked at his watch. "Quote 8, he said, his voice flat, devoid of any villainous heat. Quote 9. He didn't look like the boy I'd pulled from the creek. He looked like a vulture that had learned how to use a spreadsheet. I didn't sleep. I sat in the kitchen with my father's old Winchester across my knees, watching the shadows of the oaks stretch across the yard. But the enemy didn't come with guns. They came with flashing blue lights at 5:30 a.m. The deputy was a man I'd sold sweet corn to every summer for a decade. He stood on my porch, his hat in his hand, looking at the floorboards. 15 minutes, Sarah, he whispered. The bank sent their own security. I have to see you off the property. Justice doesn't grow like corn. You have to dig it out of the dark, cold and heavy. The dirt remembers. It always remembers. The air was bitter, the kind of cold that gets inside your teeth. I didn't scream. I didn't beg. I walked to the office and grabbed the single corrugated box that held my father's ledgers, the real history of this dirt, not the corporate lies Ethan had printed in his manila envelopes. I walked down the drive, the gravel crunching under my heels like grinding teeth. At the gate, Ethan was already there, looking like a jagged piece of glass dropped in a wheat field. He didn't speak of legacies or ghosts. He simply held a heavy galvanized chain and a master lock. He looped the steel through the fence and clicked it shut. The sound was final, a sharp, metallic snap that ended a century of sweat. He looked at me with the empty eyes of a man who only understood a $300 million portfolio, not the ground he stood on. I stood on the shoulder of the county road, the box heavy in my arms. The sun began to bleed over the horizon, turning the cornfields a deep, bruised purple. My tractor, my house, my life. It all sat behind a piece of hardened steel that cost $20 at a hardware store. I looked at the ink stain still ghosting my index finger. Ethan thought he'd bought my silence along with the soil. He thought a farmer only knew how to grow things. He forgot that to save a crop, sometimes you have to identify the parasite and starve it out. I turned my back on the house and started walking toward town. The box in my hands was light, but the weight in my chest was settling into something hard and cold, like a stone sharpened for a slingshot. He had the deed, but I had the ledgers. Justice doesn't grow like corn. You have to dig it out of the dark, cold and heavy. I knew exactly where the bodies were buried in his books. The dirt remembers. It always remembers. The trailer smelled of damp upholstery and the chemical sharp of cheap pine sol. It was a metal box that hummed when the wind kicked up across the plains, a hollow sound like blowing over the mouth of an empty bottle. My world had shrunk to 900 square feet and a uniform that scratched the back of my neck. I spent my days at the Rusty Bolt, where my hands learned the slick weight of ceramic plates and the stinging heat of industrial lye. Every shift was a blur of steam and ammonia, until Tuesday, when the sound of a new Range Rover's tires cut through the rumble of rusty trucks. Ethan walked in, the smell of pressurized leather and air conditioning clinging to his suit. He sat in the corner booth, the expensive wool of his trousers pressing against the peeling silver duct tape. I didn't look him in the eye when I poured his coffee. I watched the steam rise, a pale ghost between us. He didn't order food. He just watched me bleed through my uniform for $8 an hour, his presence a heavy weight in the room, like a hawk sitting on a fence line. When he rose to leave, he didn't say a word. He just slid a $50 bill under the saucer. It was crisp, clean, and smelled of nothing at all. It wasn't a tip. It was a leash. A reminder that he could still reach into my pocket whenever he felt like being God. That night, the trailer felt smaller. I cleared the cracked Formica table and pulled my father's ledgers from the box. The light from the single bulb overhead flickered, casting long, jittery shadows against the wood-paneled walls. I opened the books. The paper was yellowed, smelling of old tobacco and the dust of 1984. I didn't look for money. I looked for the things Ethan's digital spreadsheets couldn't see. Hours bled into each other. My eyes burned, the grit behind my lids feeling like hot sand. I traced my father's cramped, precise handwriting through decades of soil samples and irrigation logs. Around 3 a.m., the wind died down, and the silence became absolute. I found it tucked between 2 pages of crop insurance filings from '96. A geological survey map, hand-stamped by a county clerk who had been dead for 20 years. There was a blue vein marked in ink that didn't match the rest. An unrecorded subterranean aquifer running jagged and deep right under the north acreage where Ethan planned to break ground for his luxury development. Below it, a handwritten note from my father. Protected watershed. Keep the nitrates low. The state won't let a shovel touch it if they knew. I leaned back, my spine popping like dry kindling. Ethan had the deed, but he didn't have the history. He saw the land as a ledger. I saw it as a living thing with secrets buried in its throat. He wanted to pave over my father's life, but he was standing on a legal landmine he hadn't even bothered to sniff out. I picked up the $50 bill from the table, the leash Ethan tried to snap around my neck. I folded it once, then twice, the edges sharp and cold. I didn't feel tired anymore. The taste in my mouth wasn't coffee or grease. It was the metallic tang of a storm about to break. Justice doesn't grow like corn. You have to dig it out of the dark, cold and heavy. I looked at the horizon where the first frost was already silvering the broken soil. Ethan had the name on the paper, but the land knew my scent. And as the winter set in, I realized that some things don't need to be spoken to be understood. The dirt remembers. It always remembers. The diesel fumes from the idling excavators hung heavy over the north acreage, a thick, greasy curtain that tasted like a copper penny under my tongue. I stood by the rusted gate, my hands buried deep in the pockets of a canvas coat that had seen too many winters. Those yellow iron beasts were lined up like predators at the edge of my life, their hydraulic cylinders gleaming with fresh grease. Ethan stood near the lead crane, wearing a polished hard hat that had never seen a speck of real dust, looking like a jagged piece of glass dropped in a wheat field. He didn't belong here, even if his grandfather's boots used to walk this same mud. I walked toward him, the mud clinging to my boots, heavy and stubborn. He didn't turn until I was 5 feet away. He looked at me, then at the mud staining my hem, and his mouth twitched in a way that wasn't quite a smile. It was the look of a man who had already eaten and was watching the scraps be cleared away. He said. He tapped a rolled-up blueprint against his thigh with a restless, clinical energy. I said. My voice was flat, the sound of a dry creek bed. He let out a short, sharp bark of a laugh that died quickly in the humid air. He stepped closer, the smell of his expensive cologne clashing with the raw, metallic scent of upturned earth. He said, his voice dropping to a low, detached tone. He turned his back on me, signaling the foreman with a dismissive flick of his wrist. The lead excavator groaned, a high-pitched metallic shriek of steel on steel, and the massive bucket bit into the earth. It tore a jagged hole where the drainage used to be. I felt the vibration in the soles of my feet, a tremor of the ground gasping. I didn't flinch. I just reached into my pocket and felt the cold, hard edges of the burner phone. I pressed one button. "Do it," I whispered into the wind. The bucket didn't get a second bite. 4 black SUVs cut across the silt-fenced perimeter, their tires throwing up plumes of gray silt. They didn't have sirens, just the steady, rhythmic pulse of blue and red lights that looked sickly against the morning sun. Men in windbreakers with EPA-CID and State Watershed Task Force, stenciled in high-visibility yellow, stepped out before the vehicles had even fully stopped. Ethan's face went the color of unbaked dough. He started toward them, his hands raised, his voice cracking like thin ice. "This is a private development. I have the permits. Everything is documented." A tall man with a badge clipped to his belt stepped forward, handing Ethan a thick stack of papers bound in a blue legal jacket. "Mr. Vance, we have a court-ordered injunction. This site sits directly atop a Class A protected subterranean aquifer, unrecorded until an anonymous filing 2 days ago provided the historical geological surveys." The agent pointed at the churning mud where the excavator had struck. "You just breached the cap of a primary watershed with unpermitted heavy machinery. That's a federal felony. Everything stops. Now." Ethan turned to me, his eyes wide, trembling with a fury that had no place to go. He didn't look like a king anymore. He looked like a line item being deleted from a ledger. __quote _24___. I walked up to him, close enough to see the sweat pooling in the collar of his silk shirt. I looked at the hole in my land, the land he thought he could turn into a capital engine. _25, I said, my voice as cold as a November frost. _26, . As the federal agents began stretching yellow tape across his $3 million dream, the wind shifted. It carried the scent of wet stone and deep, ancient water. Justice doesn't grow like corn. You have to dig it out of the dark, cold and heavy. I looked at the horizon, where the first frost was already silvering the broken soil. Ethan had the name on the paper, but the land knew my scent. And as the winter set in, I realized that some things don't need to be spoken to be understood. The dirt remembers. It always remembers. The gavel didn't make a loud sound when it fell in the county courthouse, but it felt like a mountain shifting back into place. The ink on the restitution order was still wet, a dark, sharp line that cut through the years of Ethan's lies. I folded the paper and tucked it into the pocket of my canvas coat. It was just a piece of wood pulp, but it carried the weight of 600 acres. I drove back to the farm through a curtain of gray drizzle. The air smelled of wet slate and the metallic tang of a world being washed clean. When I pulled into the drive, the yellow EPA tape was gone, replaced by the familiar sagging wire fence that had watched me grow old. Ethan's Range Rover was long gone, repossessed by the bank. In its place sat a rusted-out Chevy Silverado with a mismatched blue door. Ethan was at the tailgate, his expensive leather loafers ruined by the thick red clay. He was throwing cardboard boxes into the truck bed, cheap boxes that buckled under the dampness. I stepped out of my Ford and didn't close the door. I just stood there. The wind tugged at my hair, smelling of turned earth. He stopped when he saw me. His face was hollowed out, the skin gray and papery like a wasp's nest. There was no polished stone in his voice now, no peppermint on his breath. He looked at the house, then at me, his hands shaking. He opened his mouth, his throat working as if he wanted to find one last legal loophole, one last clever phrase to bridge the canyon between us. I didn't give him the chance. I didn't say a word. I just watched him. I watched the way he struggled with a heavy trunk, his soft hands fumbling with the latch. He was a man who had tried to build a kingdom on air and shadows, and now the dirt was reclaiming its due. He climbed into the cab of the Chevy. The engine turned over with a wet, grinding cough before it finally caught. Justice doesn't grow like corn. You have to dig it out of the dark, cold and heavy. I looked at the horizon, where the first frost was already silvering the broken soil. Ethan had the name on the paper, but the land knew my scent. And as the winter set in, I realized that some things don't need to be spoken to be understood. The dirt remembers. It always remembers. I walked to the edge of the field. The corn was gone, replaced by the raw, open wounds of his failed construction, but the earth was already beginning to settle. I knelt down and pressed my palm against the soil. It was cold, clinging, and honest. The smell of the evening harvest wasn't about the grain this time. It was about the silence. I felt the grit under my fingernails, the permanent map of my life. I had the deed, I had the dirt, and I had the long, quiet winter to make it right again. Justice doesn't grow like corn. You have to dig it out of the dark, cold and heavy. I looked at the horizon, where the first frost was already silvering the broken soil. Ethan had the name on the paper, but the land knew my scent. And as the winter set in, I realized that some things don't need to be spoken to be understood. The dirt remembers. It always remembers.